Hello, my name is Gwendolyn Murphy, Regulatory Project Manager with the Division of Project Management. I'll be discussing the Prioritization Map 5240.3 Revision 5 and some best practices for requesting priority review. Our first case study will focus on how and when an applicant should request priority review on an amendment. In this example, an ANDA was granted priority review in the first cycle. A complete response letter classified as major was issued to the applicant at the end of the first cycle. However, when the applicant responded to the CRL, they did not request priority review with the resubmission. Ultimately, this ANDA received a standard review instead of a priority review. There are two general scenarios under which the FDA will evaluate whether a priority review may be granted. The first is when there is an explicit request from the applicant at the time of submission, which includes the prioritization factors for which the applicant believes the submission qualifies. The other scenario is in the absence of such an explicit request, the agency determines that the submission relates to a drug shortage, public health emergency, or that the submission meets the requirements of Section 505J11A of the FD&C Act. Focusing on Scenario 1, where there's an explicit request from the applicant, there are several criteria which must be met in order for the FDA to consider a request for priority review. Those include 1. The cover letter to the submission must clearly state priority review requested and reference the ANDA number. 2. The basis for the request must be consistent with MAP 5240.3, version 5. 3. The applicant must clearly and briefly state the basis for the request, including prioritization factors. And 4, the applicant must include sufficient supporting documentation for the request. In our case example, the submission was not evaluated or considered for a priority review because these criteria were not met. Now please note, priority review does not always equal a shortened goal date. Submissions that are eligible for a priority review may receive either a shorter goal date or simply an expedited review, as defined in MAP 5240.3. So what lessons have been learned? The applicant must request priority review with each submission. The cover letter to the submission must clearly state priority review requested and reference the ANDA number. It must also contain the basis for the request consistent with the MAP, including the prioritization factors. And finally, the applicant must also include any sufficient supporting documentation. Let's not forget the helpful hint that we discussed. If FDA receives a submission and assigns that submission a goal date, the agency will not adjust the goal date for that submission, even if we subsequently grant the submission priority review. For example, in an open cycle, a drug product gets added to the drug shortage list. We may grant the submission priority review, however, the goal date for that submission will not change. Now, without getting into too much detail on this section of the prioritization map, I did want to touch on a few key points. It is no longer the case that a P4 first filer will automatically receive priority review upon original ANDA submission. Rather, the submission must be ready for final approval at or before the goal date for that submission. Additionally, the applicant must clearly state request for final approval in the cover letter and provide adequate documentation showing that the application will be eligible for final approval at or before the goal date. For example, if a 30-month stay applies and that stay will not end until after the goal date for the submission, then the submission is not considered eligible for final approval at or before the goal date, and therefore that submission would not receive a priority review. FDA will prioritize submissions that will be ready for final approval at or before the goal date under the following circumstances. Submissions from applicants who satisfy the statutory definition of first applicant at the time of original submission. Applicants must summarize in the cover letter the basis for the priority review request and provide the documentation confirming the application will be ready for final approval at or before the goal date. Next, submissions from subsequent applicants who were blocked from final approval by 180-day exclusivity will qualify for prioritization once the relevant 180-day exclusivity has been triggered and until it has expired. And finally, other submissions containing a P4 certification that do not qualify under any of the sub-bullets above, if there are fewer than 4 approved drug products, including the RLD, listed in Orange Book at the time the submission is received by FDA.
Hi, my name is Dara Nardini, and I will be discussing Late Information Request, IR, Discipline Review Letter, DRL response. First, I want to provide you with an overview of what I'm going to discuss. In the first case study, it'll be a late response when a response date is provided. The second case study includes a response to an IR, DRL, when a response date is not provided. And in the third example, it'll include an incomplete response or third-party issue. In the first example, the issue is a late response to IR, DRL when a response date is provided. The background is February 1st, that DRL IR letter was issued to the applicant. March 1st was the response due date that was given in the letter. March 15th, almost 2 weeks later, the applicant submitted their response, and June 1st was the ANDA's GDUFA date. The decision was to defer the amendment. The factors that we considered were that the applicant responded later than the response due date that was given in the letter. The impact was that we issued a CR letter nearly identical to the IR, DRL deficiencies that were sent out. So it's important here to note that the agency selects a date based on the current workload and the amount of time that we need to assess that response. So the lessons learned here are to adhere to that response due date that's in your letter. Communicate with your discipline project manager. You do have an option to request a short extension of time if you need it. And this could have potentially been issued as an early CR letter. So if you can't meet that date or address the DRL IR, inform your discipline project manager. That discipline project manager can work with the RPM and they can potentially issue an early CR. In the second example, this is an actual email received from an applicant. I'm just going to read it to you. We received a discipline review letter dated 7/24. In the DRL, the agency has not mentioned any cutoff date to respond. Based on the DRL, we responded on 10/17. However, as per the CR letter, the agency has not reviewed our DRL response, and we received a CR major. We request the agency to review our point and find a way to review our DRL response, which was already filed. As you are aware, if we are considered a CR major, then our application will be delayed by months. In this case, it was not our mistake because the agency has not defined any timeline in the DRL letter. The issue here is that a DRL is issued with no response date provided in the letter, and the applicant still responds within that cycle. This background, on July 24th, the DRL was issued with no response date provided. On October 17th, the DRL response was submitted by the applicant, which is about 3 months later. December 3rd, the CRL letter was issued right before that GDF date of December 4th. So the decision was made to defer this amendment and issue a CR letter with nearly identical deficiencies to the DRL. So as you can see, even if a full response is received, the review may still be deferred to the next cycle. And that's if an action letter is being prepared or if more time or resources are needed to review those responses. So the factors that we considered when the CRL was ultimately issued with these identical deficiencies, they contain those major deficiencies. And in addition to that, the applicant's response to the DRL was close to that GDF date. So the impact here is that the applicant may have expedited their work to submit that response within the cycle, but it still did not allow us enough time for that review. So this also can impact the quality of the response. In this case, the subsequent cycle continued to include some of those major deficiencies. So the lessons learned here are that the DRLs are not generally classified when they go out to the applicant as either major or minor. However, if the DRL response contains information that either requires a more thorough review or gratuitous information not requested by the FDA, then the FDA does have the option to defer that review of the response. So the issue for our third example is the DRL IR response is considered incomplete. So our background is April 28th, the labeling DRL was issued to the applicant. On May 12th, the applicant responded to that DRL, but the response was considered incomplete. You can see the GDUFA goal date was July 1st, but we actually had an earliest lawful approval date of June 1st. When the agency received that incomplete response, the applicant was contacted and they stated that their contract labeler, third party, was closed for the summer. So the decision was made to issue a labeling-only CR just prior to this first possible approval date. Some of the factors that we considered are that labeling was the only discipline that was not adequate, and the applicant could not commit to a response within a reasonable time period. The impact was an additional cycle, and some of the lessons learned are that you should always respond completely to the IR DRL, and also it's really important to remain aware of your third party's availability. So let's finish up this portion with some helpful hints. The first one, always adhere to the requested response dates. Communicate with your discipline project manager. Depending on the timing and content, FDA may determine that a response still cannot be reviewed this cycle. And lastly, submit high-quality, complete submissions.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Nguyen, and I will be covering a couple scenarios involving unsolicited amendments to an ANDA. I just wanted to point out on this slide that under GDUFA 2, we no longer have a tiered system with solicited or unsolicited delaying or non-delaying amendments. There was a recent inquiry from industry that asked us why we didn't deem their amendment as a delaying amendment, so I wanted to make sure that you understood that under GDUFA 2, goals are based on whether the amendment submitted is standard or priority, or major or minor. Also, under GDUFA 2, if the agency requested an IR or DRL, this will neither stop nor add to the review clock. However, in the event the agency determines that the response to an IR or DRL contains information that was not requested by the FDA, or if the FDA determines that the information provided requires a more thorough assessment, FDA will classify the submission as a major or minor amendment with a corresponding goal date. In our first scenario, the goal date was extended due to an unsolicited labeling amendment. For some background information, the goal date for this application was set for March 2nd. The RLD had updated their labeling to add newly approved pediatric exclusivity, and the FDA generated a labeling carve-out template and distributed it to all applicable applicants on December 5th. The ANDA applicant in this case submitted their update on December 19th. The decision the agency made was to consider this a minor amendment, moving the goal date by 3 months from the date of receipt, and a new acknowledgement letter was issued to the applicant. We considered the fact that, in general, at the time of approval, a generic drug is required to have the same labeling as its RLD, except for permissible differences. These permissible differences include, among others, the omission of an indication or other aspect of labeling protected by a patent or exclusivity. The Division of Labeling notes in their correspondence to applicants that applications approved or those applications seeking approval prior to the expiration of the exclusivity may need to update their ANDA labeling in accordance with the attached model label. If upon review of the attached model label, you seek to submit an updated label to support approval, please do so in an amendment to your application. The FDA considered this labeling update required a more thorough assessment and classified the submission as minor with a corresponding 3-month goal date extension. In terms of impact, we understand that unfortunately this will extend your goal date. However, we would also like you to recognize that the FDA must review all of the applications that are affected by the RLD update, and this requires additional agency resources to review the material. So some key takeaways are that labeling amendments submitted in order to be consistent with the RLD will be considered minor amendments with a 3-month goal date extension. The Division of Labeling Review may provide applicants with a model labeling template to assist in carving out information protected by patent or exclusivity. If the applicant decides to submit an updated label, these will also be considered minor amendments under GDF 2. It is also important to note that if the Division of Labeling Review had not requested the ANDA labeling to match the RLD, our alternative approach would have been to issue a labeling-only CR, which would result in a longer goal date extension. Next, I will talk about late unsolicited DMF amendments. In this second scenario, approval on ANDA was delayed due to a late unsolicited amendment from the DMF holder. The background is that the goal date was set at March 1st, and the first approvable date was March 2nd. All disciplines were completed, and the last primary review was found adequate on February 1st. The DMF holder then submitted an unsolicited amendment to the agency on February 12th, and we issued an acknowledgement letter that this was considered a minor amendment to the applicant. The applicant responded that the DMF amendment submitted did not affect this particular ANDA. However, the decision was made to maintain this as a minor amendment and extend the goal date 3 months from the DMF submission. Although the DMF amendment could have had very little to no impact on the ANDA, any quality information that is submitted must be reviewed by the DMF team and will be considered a minor amendment. We also took into account that the review team was nearly finished. So the impact this had was that we missed the first possible approval date, and the imminent approval strategy was derailed. In addition, the applicant seemed unaware of this DMF change. So some lessons learned from this case is that the first approval date was very clear for this product. So make sure your DMF holders know key timeframes for your ANDA approval. In this case, delay by the DMF holder appeared possible. Also note that unsolicited amendments are not necessary for ANDA approval. And my last case will be talking about delayed unsolicited amendments. In this scenario, the issue was that an applicant decided to hold on to data because they did not want to submit an unsolicited amendment and receive a goal date extension. Some background information. The goal date was March 1st and a CR was issued on February 20th. The applicant stated that they did not submit the information during the previous cycle because they knew we consider it an unsolicited amendment and extend their goal date. The applicant then requested that we convert the CR to an IR since they had the information readily available. The agency decided to deny the request to convert to an IR and process the CR amendment as a minor with a 3-month goal date. We took into consideration that the review team already finished their work. In addition, we already issued the complete response letter. The impact that this had was that although additional data was readily available, the agency needed to extend the goal date from the date the CRL response was received, and this incomplete information ended up generating another minor amendment cycle. So our takeaway for this scenario is to please take the time to ensure your submission is complete. Putting a little more care in preparing your submission during FDA's review of the first cycle could have saved a cycle and time off the total time to approval. More importantly, communicate with your RPM if you have any concerns. In this case, the cycle could have remained open and the goal date may have been only extended by a month or two, depending on when the applicant submitted the amendment. And note, even if the goal date is extended, the review team could have possibly incorporated the amendment during their review and the agency could have still met the original goal date. And this concludes the portion of the unsolicited amendment section. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lieutenant Warren Simmons, Regulatory Project Manager with the Office of Generic Drugs, and today I will be going over some examples of requests for reconsideration, or RFRs, to help clarify the process and hopefully answer any lingering questions that you all as industry shareholders may have. I will be going over case studies for examples of an RFR that has not been accepted by the agency, a RFR that was accepted by the agency and the final decision was to deny, and an RFR that was accepted by the agency and the final decision was to grant. I would also like to refer everyone to the draft guidance, request for reconsideration at the division level under GDUFA, as this resource will help you navigate the RFR process. Let's start with our RFR not accepted example. A CR minor was issued on March the 25th, 2019 for labeling deficiencies. A CR response was submitted on April the 1st, 2019 and included a RFR to reclassify the CR minor as an IR. This RFR was not accepted because it is not possible to change the classification of a minor CR to an IR. Per the draft guidance, there are certain matters that are not appropriate for RFR. These include but are not limited to advice communicated during meetings or teleconferences, in meeting minutes, and in other correspondence such as information requests and discipline review letters. Also, new information should not be submitted as part of a RFR because FDA reconsideration of a decision that has been requested by an applicant must be based on the same information that was relied upon to make the original decision. Per the guidance, a matter that could be appropriately handled through a request for reconsideration is an FDA regulatory action that relates to an ANDA and has scientific significance. Examples include but are not limited to the following: refuse to receive decision, tentative approval letter, classification of a major amendment to an ANDA or post-approval supplement. So in this case, the amendment was a minor, which is why it wasn't appropriate. Classification of standard review status of an ANDA or post-approval supplement, and denial of a pre-ANDA meeting. Now we'll move on to an example of a RFR that was denied. A CR major was issued on October 29, 2018 due to bioequivalence deficiencies. The applicant responded on April 1, 2019, proposing to use a new active pharmaceutical ingredient supplier, we'll call Facility B, to address the deficiencies and request to reclassify the CR as minor from major. Unfortunately, deficiencies were already identified at Facility B after the facility was cited as the API supplier. The applicant stated they had withdrawn the API supplier, Facility B, from this application and would like to reinstate a previous original API, Facility A. And unfortunately, this RFR was denied because the addition of a new facility constitutes a major amendment. In addition, a deficient facility constitutes a major amendment. This is consistent with the draft guidance for ANDA submissions, amendments to abbreviated new drug applications under GDUFA. Therefore, the outcome was that the CR response retained a major classification. Lastly, let's look at an example of a RFR that was granted by the agency. A CR major was issued on July 12, 2019 due to bioequivalence deficiencies. The applicant responded to the CR on August 23rd, but before that they had requested a RFR on August 16th of 2019. In the deficiency letter, the Office of Bioequivalence asks the applicant to please provide justification with supporting information for batches that were previously submitted and stated if the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, OPQ, deems the said batch was not stable at the time of conducting the BE studies, the batch would be considered unacceptable in addition to the fasting and fed BE studies. The bioequivalence deficiency was classified as major because the deficiency pertained to inadequate in vivo bioequivalence studies due to biobatch stability and statistical issues. The applicant proposed to provide the justification on the biobatch stability and statistical data. In their opinion, the FDA would not need substantial expenditure of resources since the justification of biobatch stability and statistical data are confined to limited data and are specific to the deficiencies. The bioequivalence assessment team contacted the OGD assessment team and received their concurrence on granting the RFR to reclassify the CR response as a minor amendment. Based on the above information, the applicant's request for reconsideration of the classification of the amendment from major to minor was granted. And the outcome was that a few months after this RFR was granted, the application was actually approved in early 2020. This concludes my portion of the presentation. For questions on how to submit a RFR as well as content and format of a RFR, again, please refer to the draft guidance, request for reconsideration at the division level under GDUFA. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Parth, Soni, and I'm the RPM who's going to be discussing the post-complete response letter meeting requests. From here on, I may refer to them as post-CR meeting requests or post-CRL meeting requests. This is going to be a case-based scenario stemming from a query I received from an applicant. After describing the case, I'll go over when the post-CRL meeting request is appropriate and what our expectations are for receiving a complete package for post-complete response letter meeting. The issue involved the applicant calling me and providing a detailed explanation for a specific deficiency on a CR minor letter, which was issued about 3 weeks prior. The deficiency was requesting the applicant to perform a test which the applicant wanted to argue against. The applicant highlighted that, first, by omitting the test, they will provide assurance of the quality. Second, procuring a fresh batch for the test will be time-consuming. And third, there is only one approved product on the market, so the faster this ANDA is approved, the better it is for the U.S. generic market. During the phone conversation, the applicant was informed that such an inquiry is not something that can be handled by the RPM or other project managers over the phone or an email, because it would require reopening the review. Additionally, per the current practice, such inquiries should be submitted via Gateway for official review. I informed the applicant that they can either submit post-CR letter meeting request if they're seeking clarification of the deficiency, or submit their justification with the CR resubmission. The applicant insisted on emailing the justification so that I can reach out to quality discipline for their input. So the applicant ended up sending the explanation over an email, which was forwarded to the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality for their input. The decision was that the email inquiry regarding omitting a test requires a thorough review during open cycle and cannot be responded to via an email during closed cycle. The factors that were considered to reach the decision were that inquiry was received during closed cycle, it was also received via phone first and then email as opposed to ESG, and the inquiry was a justification to omit a test, which is not a clarifying question and requires thorough assessment. Such an inquiry received during closed cycle contributes to inefficient use of the applicant's and agency's resources. So the lessons learned from this incident are that modifying or providing explanation of a deficiency is beyond the purview of the project managers. Revisiting deficiencies during close cycle requires a thorough assessment by the review team. Unless the applicant desires clarification of the deficiency or disagrees with the major classification of the deficiency, ANDA is not reviewed during close cycle. This is to ensure that the limited resources of the agency are used accordingly. Additionally, phone or email inquiries are not official or efficient if they're not minor inquiries that do not request modifying the deficiencies. And in this case, the explanation to the deficiency is best suited for CR resubmission because the explanation provided was itself a response to the deficiency. So, after a CR letter is issued and the review cycle is closed, the most common methods by which the applicant may communicate with the agency include responding completely to all the deficiencies within 1 year as a CR resubmission amendment, or requesting extension, requesting an RFR or request for reconsideration as has already been discussed, or the option that I'm going to focus more on, which is requesting post-CR meeting. This is done when the applicant is seeking clarification on a deficiency. So that was the scenario. Now I'll be focusing on post-CR meeting requests, when they're appropriate, and what is required to be submitted as a part of a complete package for such a meeting. Post-CRL meeting is used by applicants to seek clarifications concerning deficiencies identified in the CRL. It is available for both major and minor CRLs and for first and subsequent review cycles. It's only granted if the request poses questions to clarify identified deficiencies. The request should be submitted via ESG within 10 calendar days of the issuance of the CRL. And the request cover page should clearly identify the submission as a post-complete response letter meeting request. A post-CRL meeting request may be granted if 1. A post-CRL meeting request has not already been granted for the same CRL. 2. The proposed questions seek clarification concerning deficiencies in the CRL. Now note, the word clarification is being repeated over and over again in this presentation, so it should be noted that it is very important that the questions submitted in the meeting package ought to be clarifying in nature. 3. A complete meeting package has to be submitted, and more to come about what constitutes a complete package on the following slides. 4. If a post-CRL meeting request is granted, the applicant will be notified in writing. To the extent a post-CRL meeting request contains both clarifying and non-clarifying questions, the agency will grant the meeting in part and will only answer the clarifying questions. If the agency grants post-CRL meeting in part, it will notify the applicant in writing and identify the questions that are denied. A post-CRL meeting request package should include 1. A list of proposed questions seeking clarification of the deficiencies identified in the CRL, grouped by disciplines. 2. The requested format of the meeting should be identified as either teleconference or written response. 3. If requesting teleconference, the meeting request package should include a proposed agenda outlining how the 30 minutes allotted should be apportioned to each proposed question, a list of specific review disciplines asked to participate, and a list of all the applicants' attendees with their titles and affiliations. So goal date is only available for original, complete packages submitted within 10 calendar days of issuance of the CRL. If an original complete package is submitted outside of the 10 calendar day window, the request may be granted but will be ineligible for gold date. For requests submitted within 10 calendar days of CRL issuance, for written response, an acknowledgement letter to grant or deny is issued within 10 calendar days of the ESG receipt, and if granted, FDA will provide a written response within 30 days of the request. Similarly, for teleconference, an acknowledgement letter with scheduled date is provided within 10 calendar days of ESG receipt, and the teleconference meeting is conducted within 30 days of the request. It should be noted, however, that other issues, including questions requiring further agency review, disputes about classification of complete response amendments, or new information submitted by the applicant, will not be addressed in a post-CRL meeting. And FDA will generally grant only one post-CRL meeting per CRL in the form of either teleconference or written response as requested by the applicant. The meeting will only cover questions submitted in a single complete post-CRL meeting request package. Questions submitted on a rolling basis or subsequent to original package will not be considered. This concludes my portion of the presentation covering post-CRL meeting requests. For more information regarding post-CRL meetings, you may refer to Guidance for Industry Post-Complete Response Letter Meetings between FDA and ANDA applicant under GDUFA from December 2018. I thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to reintroduce myself. My name is Dustin Derosales, and I'll be speaking with you today about the FDA's expectations of industry upon the resubmission of a complete response. Today, I'll be providing various scenarios regarding the submission of CR responses and also explain the importance and key takeaway points of each of the examples. We will go over updated guidances and other updates, as well as patents and exclusivities. Since unsolicited amendments was discussed earlier, I'll not be speaking on this topic during this presentation. Our first topic will be regarding updated guidances and other updates, such as RLD labeling updates, USP monograph changes, and guidance recommendations. When new information is available, the ANDA applicant must make all necessary adjustments to their said product and submit all necessary information as an amendment to the ANDA. So the background of our first case study is as follows. A CR minor action letter is sent to the applicant on January 11, 2019, and a CR response addressing all the deficiencies is submitted on March 15, 2020. When the applicant responded back to the CR letter, they failed to check for any updates on guidances or RLD labeling updates. And as you all know, standard CR minor amendments usually receive a 3-month goal date, and standard CR major responses are given an 8-month goal date. Therefore, in this situation, the GDUFA goal date is set to June 14, 2020, which is 3 months after receiving the amendment on March 15 of 2020. So upon receiving the CR response, the review teams were notified to initiate the reviews. Some factors that needed to be considered were that a recent product-specific guidance was posted on January 2, 2020, pertaining to the RLD of the ANDA, and an RLD labeling update was posted a few weeks prior to January 2, 2020. I would point out that an ANDA cannot be approved if it is not compliant with recent PSGs or RLD labeling updates. Now, in this situation, as a courtesy, RPMs will usually notify the applicant of changes, but it is their responsibility to continually monitor available labeling resources, such as drugs at FDA, the Electronic Orange Book, and the United States Pharmacopoeia National Formulary, which are all available online for recent updates and to make any necessary revisions. Therefore, the GDUFA goal date will then be lengthened upon the receipt of the updated BE guidance and RLD labeling update amendment. The lessons learned from this case study are to understand the importance for regularly monitoring FDA sources in order to stay up to date with new guidances and updates. Also, remember that the GDUFA goal date is dependent on the timing of submission of such amendments. In the previous case study, had the guidance and RLD labeling update been incorporated in the CR response, the goal date would not have been extended. Our next topic is patents and exclusivities. The background of our next case study is as follows. A CR response was submitted on January 16, 2019, and since the CR response is classified as a minor amendment, it is given a goal date of April 15, 2019. Also, in Orange Book, the RLD has listed patent number 1234456, which in this presentation is actually a typo. Instead of apostrophe 123, it should be apostrophe 456, and it has an expiration date of December 15, 2019. The review teams were notified to begin the reviews. During the course of the review, it was determined that all disciplines are complete and adequate, but the ANDA applicant did not submit the documentation of delivery of notice to the patent owner and RLD holder stating that they have certified P4 to patent 456. Again, the RPM usually contacts the ANDA holder and requests for such information, but in this case, there was no response. Due to this missing information, the ANDA cannot be approved and will most likely get a policy-only CR letter, therefore extending the time for approval. The lessons learned in this case study are to always monitor Orange Book to see if there are any changes to patents or exclusivities, and to always submit the required documents such as litigation information in a timely manner. Now you may ask whether these amendments will cause an extension of goal dates. The answer is no. Patent amendments do not affect the GDUFA goal date. Also, had there been communication between the RPM and the ANDA holder, the application might have been approved. Finally, here are some tips to remember. Always submit a complete response. By complete response, I mean that all deficiencies that are communicated in the CR letter should all be addressed. If there is any missing information, FDA will deny the amendment submission. Also, communication with the RPM is extremely important. RPMs are always there to help the ANDA applicants. If there is an open communication between the two parties, problems can be identified and rectified in a timely manner. There are many FDA resources that need to be monitored closely as to be current with guidances and updates. I have provided some in the conclusion of this presentation, such as Drugs at FDA and Orange Book. Also, please make sure the cover letter clearly states what is included in the amendment submission. In some instances, I have seen cover letters only state what deficiencies were addressed in the CR letter, such as quality deficiencies, but in other folders, there is labeling information. In this case, the applicant should have noted that there is also labeling information included in that submission. Also, though not necessary, creating a table that chronologically describes patent and exclusivity information would be very helpful. This will help the applicant as well as the RPM determine if there is any information missing. The next couple slides are some helpful websites for you all to look at. And now for some challenge questions. Question number 1. Do unsolicited amendments have the potential to impact your application's approval time? The answer is yes. Question number 2. Do DMF amendments have the potential to impact your application's approval time? Again, the answer is yes. Thank you, and this concludes my portion of this presentation. I now turn it over to you, Ted.